kind of picking out some things, and then we're going to come back because there's something big going on that we have to talk about. Like there's something that there's all this stuff that's kind of happening, and I don't know it all that well. I haven't studied it all that much, but it's we'll kind of get through it. We'll get through it. Okay, so we talked about chapter 15, kind of 1 through 15 already. Jesus before Pilate. And when Jesus is standing before Pilate, that looks suspiciously like Herod. Pilate has all of this power, but actually kind of doesn't at the same time. And so that's kind of important. So we'll start at verse 16. We'll start at verse 16 and kind of go through there. Okay, so verse 16 of chapter 15. The soldiers led Jesus away into the place, that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole company of soldiers, and they put a purple robe on him, and they twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him, falling on their knees, and they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put on his own clothes on him. And they led him out to crucify him. We're in chapter 15. We just read verse 20.
Okay, gotcha.
All right. So, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to Golgotha, which means place of the skull. Remember that, place of the skull. Then they offered him mixed wine with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him, dividing up his clothes and cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him, and written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." It's the same way the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults with him. I think it needs to be noted, none of this is in my notes or anything like that, but that's that all this stuff right here sounds vaguely familiar to the temptations. You know, like, so those temptations of Jesus where they're like, throw yourself off this hill, like just have everyone worship you, I'll get over there, just bow down and worship me and all that stuff. This all sounds vaguely familiar to that. And I think that's intentional. I think there's not a direct one-to-one, but it just sounds similar. Okay. Let's see here. So then, what was there anything else that was going on? We're going to talk about place of the skull here in a second. Yeah. All right. So verse 33, at noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" We're going to come back to the darkness too. When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Remember, Elijah was one of the few that his death isn't recorded, that the kind of the belief is that he didn't die, that he got on the chariot or the wagon, whatever like that, and was caught up. So Elijah's like still around and doing things, and so that's where that's coming from. They're saying, listen, he's calling Elijah, and someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, and put it on his staff and offered it to him to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. And with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. And the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Some women who were watching from a distance, among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and the younger of Joseph and Salome. In Galilee, these women followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. And we'll finish out the chapter. It was preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph brought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in linen, cut out of the rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Okay, let's talk about all of this. So the biggest thing that surprised me, surprise is not the right word, but all through the Gospel of Mark here, as we've gone through it this time, how the whole thing is kind of about power. It's all about power and how that is used. Herod is shown to have all this power, but in reality doesn't have any. Pilate's kind of the same way. We see how the disciples are constantly wanting power. We see how all this stuff, everyone wants all these things, and Jesus is kind of like the anti of all that and just kind of accepts it. Now, here's what's interesting about that. And I don't know a ton about this. I need to be more fluent. I've heard about it and all that, but you don't find it in all the commentaries. But I think it's spot on. I'm going to read one of my notes in my Bible to you. And I remember in seminary, the guy who wrote the Gospel of Mark, his commentary for Concordia, James Veltz. I remember him talking about this too. So, pertaining to chapter 15 of Mark, he says, the particular image that Mark highlights as Jesus approaches the cross have strong imperial overtones. The soldiers seem to have been reenacting either the ascension of Caesar to the throne or Caesar's triumphant procession after a great victory. What he's saying there is that Mark is writing, especially with the crucifixion narrative, a mockery of a coronation of a Caesar. Okay? So Jesus was given a bitterly cruel coronation ceremony of mockery. This would have struck Mark's Roman audience as particularly powerful, echoing the opening lines of Mark's gospel that challenged imperial claims. So if we look at that, let me go back to it. Mark chapter 1, verse 1, as he's starting all this off, he starts it off with a bang. He says, in the beginning, the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. So, the beginning of the good news about the Son of God, those are all Roman titles. Euangelion is what Caesars would say as they were conquering people. Like that's the good news. Evangelion is Greek for good news or gospel, right? Like, so as they were conquering, it's like you're entering into the good news of Rome, right? And then also Caesars, when Caesars would die, they would become gods themselves. And so the son of a Caesar would be a son of God, all right? So whenever you see in the Gospels them talking about son of God, they are mocking Caesar, all right? So like that's the son of God. So Mark, right at the beginning, the Messiah, the son of God, which they're saying things, about Jesus too, because we view him as the son and all of that stuff. But that is a mockery of that. Let me read his note here. This can good news here on Mark 1:1. This can be translated gospel. Caesar issued proclamations of euangelion for his enthronement and his birthday and victory celebrations. The content of Mark's good news, Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. If Mark's initial audience was Roman, this certainly would have been a threatening opening passage. The true king, the true God, the one with truly good news was Jesus, not Caesar. Okay? So that's how Mark's gospel begins. And then we've gone through it, and it's all about power and how it's found to be vapid and wanting kind of thing. Then we get to the crucifixion narrative. I'm going to go back to his description here in this Bible. The following parallels are very strong. So, verse 16 in chapter 15, verse 16. The Praetorian Guard gathered around Caesar. All right. Verses 17 and 18. Caesar was given a robe of Jupiter, a scepter, and an olive branch, crowned while being acclaimed, "Hail Caesar." Then, verse 21, royal procession through the streets of Rome while leading a sacrificial bull. All right. Verse 22, procession arrived at the Capitoline Hill, or the Head Hill in Rome. Golgotha means place of the skull, right? Then verse 23, Caesar was given a bowl of wine mixed with myrrh, which he sacrificially refused and poured it out onto the ground. All right. Then verse 24, the bull was slaughtered. In verse 27, Caesar climbed the steps of the temple of Jupiter with his royal officials on his right and his left. And then verse 29 and 32, crowds acclaimed Caesar and sang his praises. So I need to look more into that. But that's not our culture anymore, and it's things that we miss. That this crucifixion of Jesus is a mockery of the gods of this world, right? It's a mockery of all of that, and it's playing into that. And everyone back then would have read the crucifixion story and would have been like, oh my goodness, they're gonna hate this. That's like they're like that's, I mean, they are saying this is the thing. This is the thing. Like, this is what's going on. Like, and so like there's this whole idea of that this is just a mockery of that Roman coronation of a Caesar. And so when we think about now, when Jesus was talking about being raised in his glory, or when the gospel writer Mark is saying that Jesus had not yet been glorified, we know exactly what he's talking about, because when the Caesar was fully glorified is when he was when he's held up and they're all like chanting his name and all that stuff. That's when a Caesar is glorified. And so when Christ is in his full glory is when he is
Can you see it?
on the cross. When he's on the cross and everyone's chanting everything about him, right? Like they're chanting insults at him. They're throwing all these different things at him. He's surrounded by thieves. And we see, and it's a mockery of all that we hold dear and what our sin wants out of the world of power and prestige and all of that. It's all just a mockery of all of that. I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts about all of that? Here, can you grab the mic? You can hold it, yeah.
Not knowing an awful lot about Roman history, of course, my first thought was what they were doing to Jesus while the soldiers having some fun.
Yeah.
I mean, their view of entertainment was a lot different from ours. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean,
yeah, well, it's for most of us.
I made the joke last night. You guys still watch The Bachelor, so like
Yeah,
that's like that.
Yeah, I caught that one too.
Yeah. But
But I had never really heard that. Makes you think.
yeah,
Mark speaking to the people of his time, and I really don't know, what did the Romans think of their government? Your everyday average Roman.
well, I
who
think
wasn't a slave or whatever,
yeah, I think yeah, so emperor worship was definitely a thing, going on there, like that he would have been raised up as a god, which you still see that today. Like you don't have to look very far.
Yeah, but not everybody in the community thinks like that.
No. And it probably depends where you are too, how far out you get on the empire. But this coronation is definitely happening. Like that's, it's happening in the epicenter of Rome and all that. And so it's definitely happening in those ways. And everyone would have known, because probably after a coronation of an emperor, they would send minstrels and people like that out to tell the story to all the little towns and reenact it.
Mhm.
Which think then, if there were little scraps of Mark, or someone came in reading this gospel to them, and then a new emperor was come in, and the minstrels are telling it, and it's almost beat for beat, like that, you probably wouldn't forget it.
Yeah, true. Now,
You probably wouldn't forget that story.
Kind of true that Christianity came to the Romans more or less through the slaves.
Oh, I mean,
They would be like one of the first groups to think of Christianity be a good idea.
because Christianity looked at them.
Yeah.
Christianity, when you look at the Gospels and they were writing to it and all that, like the powers of the world, and even we struggle with this. It's hard for us to look at poverty and someone that is of a lower estate than us. And Christianity is saying, no, like it doesn't matter how low you are, you have the image of God and Jesus died for you. And so those people, Christianity would look at them, whereas everyone else wouldn't, which I think that's a good challenge. I mean, that's a good challenge for me in my own life. Like who am I not looking at? Because it's easier not to look at it, like that's, and Christianity would just stare at them, and would never leave their gaze. And so because Christian, everything that there is to be Christian is that Jesus died on a cross surrounded by thieves, where everything in the world says that you were raised up in your glory when you ascend to full power and you're surrounded by the powerful around you. It's opposite.
So things haven't changed much.
Yeah, no, nothing has changed. I think Ed said that last week, right? Like things like no, like and I think that's the whole thing is that like in our sinfulness, we want that power so bad. So let's talk about some of this other stuff that's going on. We talked about place of the skull. That's why I said I want you to remember that, because that's like something that's already called the place of the skull, and they would go to the head hill for a Caesar's coronation. Fascinating, right? It's just it's good stuff. It's good stuff. And so let's see. Then let's see. So all this stuff is happening. Then let's see, where's the one part that I wanted to point out? Oh, the darkness. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. So this is another Roman thing, right? Another Roman thing. So Rome really glommed on to eclipses. Like they're like, eclipses show that the gods are approving of what's happening, right? So there were a few Caesars and emperors that around their coronation was an eclipse that happened. And so people, are like, oh my goodness, because I mean it's wild how everything gets dark. We had that eclipse here. Was that that was like, man, that was like a year. That was 4 years ago now, that eclipse. It was here. And that was wild because everything got dark. Like everything got dark there for a little bit. And it was pretty wild. It was pretty wild. I don't know, did the eclipse, do you guys remember that eclipse there? Like, did it happen like that up in Wisconsin or something like that? I don't think you guys were in the path. But it got where it was like twilight here. Like it was just in the middle of the afternoon. And so all these ones, let's see, there was a list inside here. So I'll just read his notes about this. The symbolic meanings of darkness has more importance than the science of what caused the event. Scholars have offered numerous interpretations. Typically, darkness was a sign of judgment in the Old Testament, which we know that. But Philo claimed that an eclipse announced the death of a king and the destruction of cities. An eclipse of the sun and the appearance of a comet followed Julius Caesar's death. Another eclipse occurred before Caesar Augustus' death. 2 comets appeared during Nero's reign, and solar and lunar eclipses occurred during Vespasian's reign. These were understood as signs from the gods and as affirmation of an emperor's divine status. So I liked how this one like listed them all out there. So what I love about that is that you see that an idea of God's judgment along with something that would be lauded by the Romans as a sign of God is handled there, is all handled there at once. Fascinating stuff. So like the darkness fell on them, and so all this stuff about Rome and all these things, as these Romans would have been reading this, they would have been like, whoa, man, like all this, it would just all have sounded familiar as they're going forward here. Let's see what else, and let's see here. He's calling Elijah. We already kind of talked about that. The temple being torn in two. The temple being torn in two. My favorite way of looking at the temple being torn in two is the separation from God and his people with the temple veil being torn, that was that only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies, and it would have been ripped. I read some things that were kind of different than that. They were saying that Oh, what were they saying? It had something to do with the oh man, I don't even remember now. It obviously stuck with me, right? Does this guy talk about it at all? When I'm reading this, let me explain this Bible to you. So this NIV translation, the notes in it are basically this. It's how this guy decided to do his commentary on the Bible. Is he puts it as notes in the bottom of an NIV thing. So the notes are like way different than most notes in other Bibles. Like this is my like favorite one. All of his commentary is on how people in the first century would have understood what was happening. That's kind of his lens that he's trying to explain by. Like, how would a first century Christian have understood the things that are written down on the page? How would they have read them? So that's his lens in this. His name is Kenton Dobson, not related to James Dobson. Kenton Dobson. And so that's kind of where these notes are coming from. So did he say anything about it? Not really. I don't remember what it was. But so I really like that separation between that separation between us and the Holy of Holies is gone. And then the burial of Jesus is that guy here, Joseph of Arimathea. He was a prominent member of the council, and that he was waiting for the kingdom of God. So he was part of the group of people that are all whipping up the crowds, trying to get them to yell, "Crucify, give us Barabbas," that whole thing. He is part of that group, which means that it probably wasn't unanimous in that group as to why they wanted to get rid of Jesus. There was probably dissent in there, and there's some, it's like most organizations, right? So he is part of that, and he went to Pilate and said, "Can I have the body?" And so they buried him in a tomb. And a tomb that was able to be rolled away was meant that was a tomb of someone that was important and wealthy, most likely, because that would take a lot of chiseling to be able to roll away a stone like that. And so Jesus was placed in the tomb of someone that would have been pretty wealthy. And the way they did tombs back then is that they would wrap the body up for a year, and then after the year, the body would have decomposed a lot, and they would have put all the bones into a small box, and would have put it in the tomb somewhere else. So that's in that same tomb, but just put it away. That's kind of how they did everything back then. So did anyone have anything they want to say about any of this? All right, let's finish up the Gospel of Mark. So Jesus has risen. Chapter 16, verse 1. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus' body. Because remember, it was sitting right on the Sabbath, and they couldn't do anything, so they just put the body in there. And so, verse 2. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who's going to roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white, in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. He said, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified, but he is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as they told you." And trembled and bewildered, the woman went out and fled the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. I think that's the ending of Mark. We'll get into that here in a second, though. So they ran. So there's some important stuff going on here. It's super short and all that stuff. We just had this coronation of a king, which is coronation into death, and then he rises again, conquering all of that, conquering all that mockery, all that stuff. And here he is, and the women come to the tomb, which is a perfect image. Women come to the tomb, and they go in there, and there's a young man sitting on there, and he says something that's important. At least I think it's important. He says, but go tell the disciples and Peter that he's going on ahead of you. And the reason why I think that's important is, why does he point out Peter?
Is he not a disciple?
Yeah, well, like it's kind of sounds like that, but I think he's bringing us in, because we become, throughout this whole book, we become very invested in the story of Peter, right? Peter's the one that, as I've been saying around here, that knows what his foot tastes like, right? Like, he keeps getting it wrong the whole time, all the way to the point where he has moments of enlightened thought and gets it, but all the way to the point where he denies Jesus 3 times, right? And so I think it's interesting that he points out Peter specifically. Go tell the disciples and Peter. Because imagine what they feel like, that the entire reason why Jesus is dead is probably because they did all that bad stuff. And just by the simple act of saying, it's okay, he'll meet you in Galilee. The level of grace that is lobbed out there, right? Like the level of grace that's like, you messed up and all that stuff, but it's okay. It's okay. And I think that is a huge deal. I think that's a huge deal. And I think that's why this, we see that this is Peter's book, that he tells, go tell the disciples and Peter. And I think as we read this book, we often really understand who Peter is in ourselves, as we become invested in that story of Peter, so much so that we're kind of living through it ourselves as we're reading it. And so that's almost a call of forgiveness and grace to it, and restoration to us all. That go tell the disciples and you that I'm alive, basically. That's cool story. That's cool stuff. That's cool stuff. And I love, like, remember, everything happens fast in Mark. Everything happens fast in Mark. And I think the book ends this way. Trembling and bewildered, the woman went out and fled the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So like that's, they're going away. Like, it doesn't explain, it doesn't do anything. Like, it's just, there it is. So does anyone have any thoughts about any of that before we get on to the controversial bit here? So here's the controversial bit. The guy who wrote that, like, I should pull it up. The guy who wrote, let me find it, because it's funny. The guy who wrote the Concordia, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod's commentary on Mark, was the guy who taught me Greek in the seminary, and I did a couple other classes with him. His name is James Veltz. James Veltz. Let's see, V-T-Z. James Veltz, Mark. But I need to show you something. Maybe it's Jim. Let's do doctor. I'm spelling his last name wrong. Here we go. Here we go. There we go. Ah, that's not it. That's not it. There we go. So, I don't know if you guys will be able to see this or not. Let me put it up on this one. So it says Mark, and I don't know if you can read that, but it has his name up through Mark 16:8. And then, so he refused to write any commentary for this last little bit of Mark because he was like, it's not, they had to get this other guy, Christopher Mitchell, to write a commentary on this so that they could have the commentary in the whole book. Okay? So one of the leading scholars in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is like, that's not supposed to be in there. Like that's all right. That's why I said that. So much so that he refused to write, and they had to hire some poor sleb to write something about the end of this. So let's read this, and I want you to think about how it's read. Like we've been reading through Mark this whole time, and see if it sounds like it's written by the same person. All right, verse 9. When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and weeping. When they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen them, but they did not believe it. Afterwards, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking in the country. These returned and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for the lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. He said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands. And when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on sick people and they will get well." After the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was taken up into the heaven and set at the right hand of God. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, and the Lord worked with them and confirmed his word by signs that accompanied it. All right, there you go. Like it has none, like I don't think it has any of the gravitas of the actual gospel writer. Like it's just a like, all right, let's just quick give a summary. Let's quick give a summary of everything. And what's interesting is that there are the church bodies out there that place a lot of faith in this. People that handle snakes, it puts a lot of onus on this to do like drink deadly poisons and all that stuff. But I don't think the original writers here were all that. I don't think they were intending you to like pick up snakes and all that stuff. To me, that sounds like they're going back and remembering things that happened like in Deuteronomy, with snakes on a pole, like all of that stuff, and dealing, that God will see you through and all this stuff. So I don't think the end of Mark is necessary. Like, I don't think it's necessary. Now, Gloria. Yeah. So Gloria is saying that when you look at it, it says the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 through 20. So what that is that, so the reason why this is in our English Bibles is it was in the King James Version. Now, what you got to understand is how the King James Version came about. So they, the Bible did not just appear out of the heavens, and just was like, oh, there it is. We have the Geneva Bible in English, right? That's not what happened there. this was a pre-literate society. Remember, literate societies didn't really exist till Luther, with the Gutenberg press. Like that's really when literate societies and easy transference of information began to happen. So people would have to write down things. Now, in the Jewish times, they had they would have meticulous rabbis would copy everything down. And here's what's interesting about all those Hebrew Bibles. What they would do is they would count the amount of characters on each line that they were copying. And if a count didn't add up correctly, they would mark it down as like, this is something's not right here. My Hebrew Bible has all those notes in it from the thousands of years that stuff's been handed down. All those notes of like a rabbi going, oh man, I don't know what to do. So they'll include both. That's what they'll do. And so I have all those notes. They're called textual variants, right? Now, the early church is filled with a bunch of slaves and wealthy people too. There's not a whole lot of work that is transferring all this stuff. Like the whole like system of rabbis copying scripture over that just doesn't exist in the church at the beginning. It's just not there. And so people write these down, would write, like the Gospel of Mark would come out and people would write it. And writing was incredibly expensive back then too. Incredibly expensive. And people would get something that was written and they would go around and they would, tell it to folks. They would give it to others. And the thing is all these other gospels got really popular at the same time. All these stories about Jesus. We know some of these. Gospel of Thomas is one. There's other ones. I'm sure there's plenty of them out there that are lost to time, lost to time. And the reason why we have books like Luke and Mark and all that stuff and some of Paul's writings is that the church ended up getting together. I think it was around the Council of Nicaea where they wrote the Nicene Creed. And I think it was at that time. I could be wrong about that, but it was a similar thing, kind of, if it's not the same. They got together and they said, we got all of these things that are circulating through all these churches. Let's get together and decide right now which ones are the best. And so they got together and they said, these gospels, like the book of Acts, like these books of Paul, because Paul references books of his or letters of his that are not in our Bible. He references them. And they're like, these are the ones that are the most edifying. Books like Hebrews and Luther didn't like James. Revelation. I can't remember about Hebrews or not. Revelation almost didn't make it into our canon at that meeting. Like it almost didn't make it in. And so, so the Apocalypse of John almost didn't make it in. And so they put it together. So our New Testament list of books is really the church trying to be pastors and saying, hey, we think these are better than all the rest of the stuff, right? And I think that's kind of the best way to look at it, is like these guys are trying to be pastors and going, focus on these. Well, these are good. And there's a certain artfulness to like the four gospels and how they tell the story and all that stuff. But they had all of those things, but so they had to copy them by hand. they had to copy, like if a church got a copy of one of Paul's letters or one of the Gospels, they would copy it down as best as they could. But if we copied stuff, we'd make little mistakes here and there, right? So even though they're trying as best they can, they would make mistakes. So my Greek New Testament in there, as they find these documents in these dry caves in the Middle East, because humidity kills papyrus and all that stuff, they find them in dry caves in there. They would look at them and they would compare them to other ones that they have. And if there are some that look older and are agreeing with most of it, they would go, all right, this is probably what it is. And then in my Greek New Testament, they give the number of what codex it is and go, it reads differently in this way in the bottom of the page. So the Greek New Testament has a lot of the textual variants in the bottom of it, because they don't want to kick it out, but they kind of want it to be like, here's kind of what's going on. So all these things are kind of brought together. They didn't fall out of heaven. They're kind of transferred through like the most human way possible, right? And I think the end of the Gospel of Mark, I think someone who was probably trying to be a good pastor was going, boy, this ends weird. like they didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. Like the ending's weird. And so he offers just a quick summary of what all this looks like, because that was probably part of sermons and stuff like that they had heard that had been transferring down and all of that. Yeah, you want to say something?
Yes, it kind of reminds me of a family reunion.
A family reunion?
Oh, yeah, I say, do you remember Uncle August? Oh, yeah, didn't he do this sometime? And before you know it, you got some oral history going and stuff,
Yeah.
and it may not jive with what your cousin remembers.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And seems to me like Mark was written down. And like you say, somebody was raised this, something was left off here. And this ought to be down, like the stuff about the demons and the snakes.
Yeah.
Wasn't that in there too?
Yeah.
It should have been.
It could have been. So
You know what I mean?
what's also interesting about the oral history stuff. So oral history is a skill that we have lost. We don't have it anymore. But we have written history now. There's pros and cons to both. So back when cultures had oral history, basically something like this would happen. Like if something big happened in a town, pretty much everyone would get together and they would talk about the story and they would work it out, and then they would leave with like the story kind of all together, which is kind of interesting. That's not something that happens really today. You can see the history in it. We peer review journals and papers. Like that's like peer reviewed studies. You guys have all heard about those. You guys are in education, you know that, right? Like that's kind of the same idea coming into the written text, right? That it's like, it's not just one person's thought. It's like all of us are kind of signing on and saying, hey, this is good, right? So that's kind of how oral history kind of worked for a while. So it was much more, so it's, what I'm trying to say is, back when they were good at oral history, we could really trust it. Like and I think that's an important thing to remember for us, that we could really trust oral history, that they had worked out a way to really tell the story. Whereas, so like it wasn't as flippant as like our family reunions are back then, but that it does play into it there. It does play into it. So let's see here. Yeah, so that's kind of what I think happened at the end there. That and some people get so worried about it that, oh, is it in there or not? I don't really worry about it. Like I see pastors trying to do their best job, trying to be, and we have some of that left over. Oh, I didn't talk about where the King James came from. A lot of our translations now, we have found all these old manuscripts in the last 100, 150 years in dry caves in the Middle East. King James is not written off of those. They didn't have any of that. So what they had is like the Latin Vulgate and things like that, which were passed down translations. They're all passed down, going through all these different translations till it got to the King James, where he assembled everything up. So and the King James Bible is really the standard by which our current Bible is made, even to this day. There are poor translations that the King James Bible translators did, but they are so ingrained in our psyche that our current ones will still translate them poor, because it's not a huge deal, not a huge big difference. But if you changed it that much, when people would read it, they'd be like, what? And they would get upset for no reason. Like, so they make a decision to be like, well, let's translate it like that. It keeps people trying to be pastors, people trying to be, trying to honor people's faith as best as they can is what's happening. So, so that's the Gospel of Mark, and a little bit of lesson about biblical interpretation and all that stuff. I don't know, did anyone have any thoughts about Mark or anything at the end that kind of stood out to them or anything?
I never looked at it like you talked about power and all that before.
Yeah.
It was just more like a story. You didn't look at how it was all connected. That was very interesting.
Yeah, like, so I knew about the power stuff, but I didn't realize through this time that it wove all the way through it like it did. Like, I knew about like the bit about like the disciples wanting to be the greatest and all that stuff. But this is the first time that I've really seen it through. And Mark is the one I know the best. And I didn't see it to this last time. Like, so that's kind of, I was kind of fascinated by that too. And so that's cool. Yeah, I mean, anything else? Anything else? Well, good deal. Well, we're not going to get together next week. I mean, we could, but I don't feel like it. And so so we'll do something after that. I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know what you're going to do. So if you have any ideas of what we can do, the reason why I've been reading all this is because of COVID. Like, this really kind of seemed to be the best thing. I don't know if we've kind of gotten into a groove where we go back to what we were doing before, where we were just listening to scripture and then kind of talking about it. Or we can go through something else kind of at a slower pace like we did this. So if you have any ideas, let me know, and I'll think about it as well. So yeah, good deal. Well, I'll say a blessing and a prayer for us. Lord, we thank you that you have brought us all together here. And Lord, as we looked at your gospel there, and we see Jesus being coordinated like a Caesar, but instead of the most powerful around him, it was thieves and robbers, and he took on death for us all. Lord, let us not seek after the power and being on the powerful right and left. But Lord, let us follow in your footsteps, that we may see the servants and the people that are low all around us, and that we can see you in their eyes and their faces. Lord, help us to be a servant like you were a servant to us. Lord, in Jesus' name, amen. Good deal. It's good seeing you guys. Thanks for coming today. And we will see. Is your guys' health doing okay?
Yes.
On the live stream. Yeah.
Yes, we're doing great.
Good. I may be able to get a vaccine the next 2 weeks. So good old Ronnie D just lowered it down to 18 in 2 weeks. It goes down to 18. Yeah. So that's going to be a mad rush.
They haven't got all the 1As up here done yet, and they're starting to expand it. So,
That's what I was like. There, we had a couple people here that were kind of hemming and hawing about getting it, and they're like, oh, I'm like, you better get it before it gets to my age group, because if you think your fingers are going to be fast enough to beat people on phones and stuff like that to sign up for stuff, then people like me, like you're gonna get delayed by months. Like that's like, so like that. So the people that are having problems getting it, like talk to a doctor and they can get you on a list. Or I don't know, is your neighborhood doing anything to get it in the neighborhood?
ours is actually, we're on a list with the hospital,
Okay, good.
with UPMC, but they've been so slow.
Oh, really? Like that's kind of my mother-in-law just got her first shot, and she was worried because she wanted to make sure she didn't do anything wrong, so she was like paralyzed to sign up for it. But her neighborhood just did a big, like, you could sign up for it at the neighborhood, and they brought in some nurses and they just did a drive-through for Kings Isle there. And so I thought that was pretty good. So if you're on a list, that's good. That's good. At least you're on a list. Like I'm not
On a
on.
list. Don't know where we are on that list, but
But but I've heard like people like Jenny Brenlinger and things like that. She has her doctors making sure she'll get it. And so that's good. But
all I got was the last time I went to the doctor, pulmonary doctor, he says, get the shot. Well, where do I get it?
that's right. Well, good deal. Well, you guys stay healthy, you guys too. And we will see you guys, I don't know, in a couple weeks.
Okay, have a great Easter.
You too. You too. All right. Bye.
All right.
Well, thanks for coming, everyone.